Okay, let's dive right into today's explainer, where we're unpacking a deeply troubling, decades-long history. We're looking at the systemic, institutional abuse that happened inside Austrian youth welfare facilities and Catholic homes. And look, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a really profound look at how societal structures can completely fail the most vulnerable people among us, and how, eventually, the truth just forces its way out into the light. For decades, the system actively suppressed the raw, unfiltered voices of the victims. I mean, listen to this statement. "On this day, my childhood died." That sentence alone really sets the stage for the immense human cost of this whole thing. We aren't just talking about abstract bureaucratic policies today. We're talking about stolen childhoods. We're talking about lifelong trauma that was just ignored by the exact people whose literal job was to provide care. Statements like this highlight something really dark: how vulnerability and lower social class were essentially weaponized against these kids in both state and private care. You know, these kids mostly came from impoverished or fractured backgrounds, and society at the time subtly and honestly sometimes overtly just deemed them expendable. Being a welfare child wasn't seen as the status that required extra protection. Tragically, it was often used as an excuse for harsh discipline, complete exclusion, and profound neglect. So that brings us to a massive question. How in the world does abuse happen on this scale, across multiple facilities, for literally decades? How does a modern society allow that? Well, it wasn't just a few rogue individuals. To pull this off, it required an entire ecosystem of silence, widespread complicity, and massive structural blind spots to survive. And public awareness definitely didn't happen overnight. Back in 1995, allegations against Vienna's Archbishop Hans Hermann Grower sent a massive shockwave through the country. Then, in 2004, a major scandal at the St. Polten Seminary forced another high-profile resignation. But it really wasn't until 2010, triggered by revelations in neighboring Germany and cases at the St. Peter and Kremsmünster Abbeys, that an absolute avalanche of testimonies finally broke the nationwide silence for good. Now, to understand exactly how the system worked for so long, we need to look at the concept of a total institution, because that's exactly how these facilities operated. In places like the Wilhelmenberg Castle in Vienna or the provincial homes in Tyrol, children were completely cut off from the outside world. Think about it. No normal socializing factors, absolutely zero external checks and balances, and this incredibly rigid hierarchy that demanded unquestioning obedience from both the children and the lower-ranking staff. It was a completely closed loop. Which brings us to the terrifying contradiction right at the heart of the system. On paper, the official bureaucratic goals of these welfare homes sounded completely noble: cleanliness, social integration, education, right? But the grim institutional reality that the children actually lived through was the exact opposite. Every single day, they faced degradation, they faced forced labor instead of going to school, and they endured severe physical and sexual violence that was sickly disguised as pedagogical discipline. What's truly chilling, though, is how actively the system protected itself from any kind of scrutiny. Just before the Wilhelminberg home closed in 1977, staff literally threw service books and official records into an incinerator and burned them. Gone. And then there's the terrifying flashlights phenomenon. Former residents were called strangers, accessing the poorly secured, unlit grounds at night to prey on the isolated kids. They called these intruders fireflies because of the flashlights they carried in the dark. It's just horrific to even imagine. But you know, bureaucracy and isolation weren't the only tools of control here. The system also leaned heavily on medical authority to justify its cruelty. Instead of actually providing care, certain branches of the psychiatric establishment were literally weaponized. They were used to legitimize the total, systematic neglect of these children's most basic human rights. Child psychiatry was frequently used as a blunt instrument of control. The trauma and the social problems of these lower-class children were actually pathologized. They were turned into supposedly unchangeable, problematic character traits. So if a child acted out because they were being abused, they were scientifically labeled as unteachable. A key figure in the sources is Dr. Maria Nowak-Vogel at the Innsbruck Psychiatric Observation Station. Her authoritative diagnoses provided the exact scientific cover the system needed to permanently exclude these kids from normal society. This weaponization of authority created what sociologists call social silence, and it perfectly explains the timeline we looked at earlier, why so many victims waited 30 or even 40 years to finally speak up. When you're a highly marginalized victim, you often feel entirely unjustified in speaking out. You deeply believe your trauma has absolutely no standing in wider society. You just think, who's going to listen to me? Because these children were so heavily stigmatized by society from the moment they were born, a lot of them completely internalized the abuse. They were told over and over that they were worthless, and eventually they believed the narrative. They thought they were simply expendable or just inherently bad. Essentially, the profound shame that belonged to the perpetrators was effectively transferred straight onto the shoulders of the victims. So when victims finally did break that social silence and tried to fight for justice, they ran headfirst into a massive clash of realities. On one side, you've got the victim's reality: lifelong psychological trauma, severe depression, derailed careers. But on the other side, you have the legal system's reality. And the legal system demands concrete, documented evidence, which, as we know, was literally burned in some cases, and it operates on very, very strict statutes of limitations. And that legal hurdle was severely complicated by extreme medical realities. For instance, many victims suffered from dissociative disorder. Basically, as a survival mechanism, their brains severely repressed or completely detached from the horrific memories of their childhoods, just so they could function in their everyday adult lives. They literally could not remember the abuse until decades later, when some random trigger suddenly brought it all rushing back. However, the legal system is famously inflexible. The Austrian Supreme Court objectively ruled that this psychological condition, this complete dissociation from the traumatic memory, does not legally pause the 30-year statute of limitations for criminal prosecution. That ruling was a massive blow. It effectively blocked countless victims from ever seeking criminal justice against their abusers. But despite those immense legal barriers, the 2010 watershed moment forced a new era of reckoning anyway. Society had to find a structured path toward accountability completely outside the criminal courts. And that unfolded in three main phases. First, breaking the silence through massive media amplification. Second, establishing independent investigation commissions like the Klasnik Commission. And finally, implementing real models for financial and therapeutic compensation. To give you a sense of the sheer scale of what these commissions uncovered, it is just staggering. The Klasnik Commission alone recognized over 3,200 positive cases of abuse within the Catholic Church's sphere by the year 2025. Over 3,000. That is thousands of individual lives fundamentally altered by institutional betrayal. It's a huge, heartbreaking number. So to offer some measure of financial restitution, a 4-tier compensation model was created. It ranged from a base of €5,000 for acknowledged victims all the way up to €25,000 and beyond for extreme cases of hardship, alongside covering vital therapy costs. Now, obviously, money can never, ever undo the past, but the structured acknowledgement, it was an absolutely critical step forward for the victims. And the cumulative financial impact of this reckoning is massive. According to the data, over €37 million have been paid out by the church to victims over the last 15 years. 37 million. It serves as a very tangible metric of the sheer scale of the abuse and the massive effort required to provide even a baseline of restitution. Simultaneously, state actors started stepping up too. The provincial government of Tyrol acted really swiftly in 2010, offering formal political apologies and setting up their own compensation models. The city of Vienna initiating massive historical investigations into all their city-run homes. And through all of these hearings, a very clear realization emerged. Above all else, the victims were seeking acknowledgement and dignity. They didn't just want money, they wanted their truth to finally, officially be on the record. Ultimately, the biggest takeaway you should get from this explainer is that breaking systemic abuse doesn't just require punishing the bad actors. It requires actively breaking the social silence we talked about earlier. It requires us, as a society, to actively listen to those pushed to the very margins and to grant victims the basic human dignity of simply being believed when they find the courage to speak up about the powerful. So I'll leave you with this final thought. Now that we know exactly how easily total institutions can hide in plain sight, protected by bureaucracy, by medical authority, and, honestly, by societal indifference, what are we doing today to ensure the most vulnerable among us are truly protected? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking the tough questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.